Good evening. My name is Fred Magdoff, and I'm a member of the board of the Will Miller Social Justice Lecture Series. It's a pleasure to welcome you to our fall 2022 lecture. Jenny Brown speaking on the secret agenda behind the anti-abortion crackdown. A group will be watching this together at the University of Vermont, and we hope that group viewing will occur at other locations for an in-depth discussion following Brown's talk. I'll be back at the end of the talk to moderate a short question and answer session. If you have specific questions, please ask them in the chat function of your browser. It's a pleasure to turn you over to Liz Medina, who will be introducing this evening's speaker. She's the Executive Director of the Vermont State Labor Council, AFL-CIO. She previously worked at Goddard College in Plainfield, Vermont, where she did labor organizing and served as a union steward. Her organizing work also involves the Vermont Workers Center and the Green Mountain Labor Council. Over to you, Liz.
Welcome and good evening. My name is Liz Medina, and I'm the Executive Director of the Vermont State Labor Council, AFL-CIO, which is our state's federation of labor unions representing over 11,500 union members across the state. At our last convention, we passed our Abortion Rights, Our Workers' Rights resolution. In addition to outlining a plan of action, the resolution officially recognizes the underlying reality of abortion bans and forced births, which is that they are inherently a form of class war. Specifically, our resolution states, quote, "Whereas the wealthy will continue to possess the means to access safe abortions in other states or countries, the working class, poor women and parents in marginalized communities seeking the same option will face life-altering financial decisions," end quote. Likewise, our guest lecturer for this evening, Jenny Brown, brings a working class perspective to the issue of reproductive justice. Jenny Brown is a national women's liberation organizer and former editor of Labor Notes. She has written numerous books and articles, including Birth Strike, The Hidden Fight Over Women's Work, and most recently, Without Apology, The Abortion Struggle Now. Throughout her work, Jenny Brown has chronicled the struggle between the ruling class and the working class over reproductive labor in the United States. On the one hand, US employers want a continuous supply of healthy and trained workers without paying for it. And on the other, working class women and those able to bear children want real support for raising the next generation of workers, such as paid family leave and a national healthcare system, as well as the right to withhold their reproductive labor. Increasingly, the capitalist ruling class has undermined our right to withhold our labor, including our reproductive labor, which is why we are gathered here this evening. For this reason and more, we are proud co-sponsors of tonight's lecture, The Secret Agenda Behind the Anti-Abortion Crackdown, which is part of the Will Miller Social Justice Lecture Series. The Will Miller Social Justice Lecture Series began in January of 2005 in honor of Will Miller, who passed away in March of 2005. Will Miller was a social justice activist and a philosophy professor at the University of Vermont for 35 years. This lecture series brings speakers to the Burlington, Vermont community to provide us with a radical analysis of social, ecological, and political concerns. Speakers are invited to talk about relevant and current issues and provide us with radical insights on topics that Will would want us to be discussing. True to Will's wishes, we have an in-person discussion immediately following the lecture. So to those of you who have joined us in person, an extra special welcome for coming out tonight, and please stick around to continue the conversation. Please join me in welcoming Jenny Brown.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everybody who worked on this and for inviting me. I'm very honored to be part of this lecture series. I should open by saying that the ideas in the books that you mentioned are not my ideas alone. They were developed in two DEW-supported groups of feminist radicals National Women's Liberation, which was mentioned, and also Redstockings. Redstockings was a key group in getting abortion legalized in New York State in 1970, 3 years before the Roe versus Wade decision. And National Women's Liberation is maybe best known for winning a 10-year campaign to get the morning after pill over the counter in the US, which I'll talk about a little more. And also these books were a group project in another important way. It was membership dues that provided the financial support that allowed me to take the sustained time to write them. So from 2003 to 2013, we campaigned to make the morning after pill, which is basically after sex contraception, available without a prescription in the United States. And dozens of other countries already had this when we started. So it's also known as emergency contraception, and it's effective up to 120 hours after sex, but it's most effective the sooner you take it. So the prescription requirement meant that if you needed it, say, starting on a Friday night, it was like this comical rush to try to find a doctor or clinic, get a prescription, fill the prescription, pay for all of those things, and then use it in time for it to be effective. So in 2003, the Food and Drug Administration's medical experts agreed that all this extra time and expense was unnecessary and it was a public health hazard. And they voted 23-4 that the drug should go over the counter, and 27-0 that it was safe. But if you read the controversy surrounding it, you would think this was the most dangerous pill in America. Congress members sent inflammatory letters urging the FDA to reject it. Powerful players in the George W. Bush White House pressured the agency, which was a violation of the FDA's rules. And then when the FDA finally recommended making the pill over the counter of all for all ages, which was our demand, the administration of newly elected President Barack Obama overruled it. He said he didn't want his young daughters to be able to buy this pill. So we debated why this was true among ourselves as we were doing all of the organizing. We testified about our experiences with contraception before the FDA's advisory panel. We faxed thousands of signatures to the FDA pledging to illegally give a friend the morning after pill. We threw packages of the pill into the crowd at rallies. We had it as a door prize at our fundraisers, and we even linked arms and sat down and blocked the FDA's headquarters one time and all got arrested. And then 9 of us also signed on to a lawsuit asking the FDA to basically follow its own procedures and put the pill over the counter for all ages. And in 2013, we won unrestricted access when a federal judge ordered the Obama administration to make the pill available. So it's now over the counter, available to all ages and genders. But we were surprised that the Obama administration joined the attack on the morning after pill. We had grumbled about the Democratic Party, but it still seemed to support reproductive rights. And here we were talking about a contraceptive. Well, I was working for the Redstockings archives at the time, and we started to look a little more closely at why opposition to birth control was once again becoming mainstream. And we looked at the history of birth control restrictions in the US. We looked at the dropping US birth rate and establishment reactions to it. We looked at the situation in other countries, and we looked at our own experience of having and raising children or deciding not to. And our main conclusion is that abortion is really wrongly being classified as a cultural issue. And in fact, we believe that the bearing and raising of children, who will do it and who will pay for it, is a key economic battlefront. So I'll spend a little time laying out our argument for that, and then I'll tackle some of the implications for how we organize for reproductive freedom. Well, for decades, we've been told abortion is just this wedge issue. It's used by Republicans to split working class Catholics from the Democratic Party and to excite Protestant evangelicals. And according to this view, politicians and the 1% don't really care one way or the other about abortion. They're really just using the issue to get votes. This explanation has frayed as we've gotten more and more abortion restrictions, and I think it can now be retired completely as we now have abortion entirely illegal in a dozen states and battles in several more. These same forces that want to outlaw abortion nationally are attacking contraception, which reveals that their stated goal of reducing abortions is really a ruse. Even among ordinary people opposed to abortion, 80% support birth control. So there's not like a clamor to ban contraceptives. That's not coming from the grassroots in any way. And now looking at the feminist archives, you can see that in the second wave that started in the 1960s, women's childbearing role was primarily seen as a vulnerability, an unfair burden, and an excuse to discriminate against women. And all that was certainly true. But as birth rates have fallen throughout the developed world, becoming lower than what is required for a replacement of the existing population, this baby bust has revealed the other side of our procreative work, which is its necessity and its power. We noticed that in many other capitalist countries, panic over birth rates has led governments to create programs to help us bear and rear children. So providing generous paid maternal or parental leave, free or subsidized childcare, universal health care, monthly cash payments to parents, plentiful sick leave, long vacations, shorter work weeks, free schooling through college, and subsidies for housing. Here in the US, by contrast, the labor of bearing and rearing children is done really cheaply, with the cost pushed onto the family to be paid out of our strained wages or added to our unpaid workload. The US is virtually the only country with no national paid maternity or parental leave law. 50 countries provide 6 months or more paid leave. So when it comes to compensating the labor of having kids, the US is really at the bottom. Now, when we looked at why abortion was outlawed in the first place in the United States, we learned that abortion was legal at the founding of the country, as long as it was before what they called quickening, which is when you can feel the fetus move, which is around the 4th month. And quickening depended on the report of the person who's pregnant and didn't want to be. So we can say abortion as we think of it today was largely legal. But birth control and abortion were outlawed completely throughout the country in 1873 with the federal Comstock law. So what happened? We had always understood that it was prudery, control of women's sexuality, religious objections, but it turns out that these were really not the main reasons given at the time. And in fact, discussions of abortion in the 1860s are peppered with references to declining birth rates. State laws against abortion were enacted by men worried that women were, quote unquote, avoiding the duties and responsibilities of married life, resulting in smaller families. They feared that women were abandoning their child-rearing work at home to get jobs or take up careers, and they worried that Protestant native-born married women were using abortion to limit births, while Catholics and recent immigrants were having lots of children. An Ohio Senate Select Committee convened in 1867 asked, quote, "Shall we permit our broad and fertile prairies to be settled only by the children of aliens?" Unquote. So if not, the committee said, native-born women must be convinced not to have abortions by making the practice illegal. By the 1870s, many states had passed statutes that outlawed all abortions, no matter how early they were. And the new laws provided punishment for women as well as practitioners, which indicated that the lawmakers were aiming to stop women from getting abortions and not just trying to deter incompetent practitioners who were injuring or killing their patients. And the ban became total in 1873. All abortion was outlawed along with contraceptives and any information about sex or the process of reproduction. The federal Comstock law gave that famous purity crusader, Anthony Comstock, the ability to raid any bookstore, medical facility, college, office, or home to seize not just contraceptive devices or abortion pills, but any written descriptions of abortion and contraception, including medical texts. All of it was classed as obscenity. And then many Comstock laws followed in most states, and some were even stricter, explicitly forbidding doctors to convey information to their patients about contraceptive options and abortion. So contrary to the impression left by some accounts, the Comstock law was not really the accomplishment of one freakishly effective prude, but the triumph of a crackdown decades in the making against women who were curbing their reproduction. Well, fast forward 100 years. While the birth rate was high during our long post-war baby boom, and actually longer than most other countries in the war, it dropped abruptly in the 1970s as birth control and abortion became easier to get. And then the birth rate in the US was a demographic puzzle through the 80s and 90s. Despite being a developed country, our rate stayed high while it was dropping below the 2.1 children per woman replacement rate in much of the developed world. 2.1 children per woman on average are required to replace her and her male counterpart in the population. But starting in this century, the US birth rate has dropped below that, and it's now considerably below the level needed for a stable population at 1.64 children per woman. Well, this declining birth rate has caused concern and even panic among some in the establishment. Stephen Philip Kramer of the National Defense University wrote a book in 2014 called The Other Population Crisis: What Governments Can Do About Falling Birth Rates. He writes, quote, "Declining birth rates constitute a problem for the survival and security of nations in the broadest existential sense of national security. For several hundred years, economic growth has been tied to growth in population, increasing the size of the domestic market and labor force," unquote. And then we notice that the worries cross the political aisle. Philip Longman of the centrist New America Foundation writes in his book, The Empty Cradle, that, quote, "Capitalism has never flourished except when accompanied by population growth, and it is now languishing in those parts of the world, such as Japan, Europe, and the Great Plains of the United States, where population has become stagnant," unquote. In July this year, a front-page Financial Times headline said, "Lowest global population growth since 1950 raises economy fears." 2/3 of the world lives in countries with below replacement birth rates, the story noted, and Europe's population is now shrinking. They quote Charles Goodhart, the dean of British economists and a former head of the central bank, who said, "Unless you get a productivity miracle, overall economic growth will fall." And he has also written a book about demography that just came out last year. In the US, William Galston of the Brookings Institution claims that in the United States, quote, "The principal driver of slow growth since 2008 has been a sharp slowdown in the growth of the labor supply." So these writers and many others fret about flagging consumer demand, immigration and its attendant political problems as they see them, an aging workforce causing rises in entitlement spending, by which they mean Social Security and Medicare, and how to keep the US military strong when both the working age tax base and the supply of young people to enlist are shrinking. But mostly they worry about that holy grail of economic growth, and that they believe it will be undermined if the population shrink. This sea change has been largely unnoticed by feminists, and I think this is probably because second wave feminism arose in the mid-60s during that brief 20-year period when government planners were actually panicking not about low birth rates, but about high ones. That is, they were panicking about overpopulation. And for feminists, this period is burned in our minds because it was characterized by horrific reproductive coercion in the form of forced sterilization aimed at women who received welfare, and in particular women of color, and in particular African Americans, Mexican Americans, and Puerto Ricans. The sterilization operation was so common, it was called a Mississippi appendectomy, and in Puerto Rico, it was simply referred to as La Operación, the operation. This population panic and the forced sterilization that accompanied it lasted 2 decades, from the mid-50s to the mid-70s. And it coincided with that period that the feminist movement built into a second wave. But it's a different world now. Governments across the world are openly trying to raise birth rates. However, many feminists continue to suspect the power structure is preoccupied with too much population, especially among the low-aged and women of color. And this has kind of caused us to tune out, even as establishment think tanks agonize about low birth rates, warn of worker shortages, and decry aging populations. Well, perusing the reports of elite think tanks, we also learned that this politician's term, pro-family, has a very specific meaning. This phrase always seemed to be hypocrisy coming from Republicans who are usually found trying to cut the services that families need. But it's not just a marketing gimmick, there's a specific political program behind it. If you're going to cut government programs or forestall new ones, you need to push those functions into the family, by which they mean primarily women's unpaid labor. And they talk about this. Here's a quote from conservative reformers Ross Douthat and Reihan Salam on their version of a small government, big family America. Quote, crafting pro-family policies is not a question of turning back the closet to some lost Ozzie and Harriet golden age. Quite the opposite. Precisely because the world has changed with the demise of lifetime employment and increasing returns to education, strong families are growing ever more important, and policies that encourage people to form them and keep them together are ever more necessary, unquote. So in other words, when unemployment or illness hit, people should be made to rely on their families for solace and support, the better to allow cuts in unemployment insurance, welfare, healthcare, home care, Social Security, and education funding, cuts that these particular pundits are for. Ross Douthat, who is now a New York Times columnist, explained in an interview that not just strong families, but large families are required. He says, quote, one of the things we've seen over the last 30 years is that in the absence of government programs, people aren't able to function usually as atomized individuals. You need some intermediary institutions if you're going to have small government. So you need strong families, you need people who are willing to have large families, for instance, which can then help provide for them in their old age. So if Republicans are serious about reforming Social Security or finding a way to increase the number of young workers paying into the program, then having a country with high population growth, larger families is an obvious and conservative way to do it. So we call their program Small Government, Big Families. And this focus on families, as in the Fire and Brimstone group, focus on the family, kind of makes perfect sense. These groups have a different understanding of family than most people you would ask, right? Families are not, to them, based on love or a unit to face the struggles of life together. Their idea of family is it's a production unit for children. And this seems to be the underlying motive for a lot of anti-LGBT politics and discrimination that we're seeing right now. Former Pennsylvania Senator and anti-LGBT warrior, basically, Rick Santorum, is explicit on this point in his writing. The point of marriage is to have babies, he says. So marriage equality will lead to lower birth rates. And anyone who deviates from this model must be punished in an effort to get everyone to conform. And this is one reason their agenda includes these anti-LGBT laws like Florida's Don't Say Gay bill, attacks on marriage equality, and the anti-trans bathroom bills, and the attacks on trans healthcare that we're seeing. Well, when we compared our situation to Europe, where the birth rate is as low or lower than the United States, we found there the birth rate is openly discussed as a problem by politicians and in newspapers. And efforts to raise the birth rate have mostly focused on making it easier to have children by fully funding childcare and providing long paid parental leaves. Now, in some places like Turkey and Poland, leaders attack reproductive rights with the open goal of raising the birth rate. And in others like France and Sweden, where there are stronger feminist movements, governments promote policies that support parenting, and they've actually experienced some higher birth rates as a result. And then some countries like Russia are doing both, increasing maternity leave and monthly government payments to parents. At the same time, they're gnawing away at access to abortion and contraception. But in all cases, the reasons for the policy are out in the open. How can we get women to make more babies? And one way is to make it easier to combine work and family. in an article called Breaking the Baby Strike in The Economist, they explained that the falling birth rate in Turkey is caused by, they said, ask Turkish women about work and motherhood, and the response is a torrent of grievances. Husbands do little housework, employers are unsympathetic. In short, mothers are generally still expected to stay home. Until that changes, Turkish women will perceive a sharp choice between work and parenthood and often go for the first. And you can imagine that that's also something that we are experiencing here. And so when we started to think about this in our group, the falling birth rate made perfect sense to us. Many of us are in our 30s and 40s. We could clearly see how the difficult conditions we face were causing us to decide to have fewer children. I remember this consciousness raising meeting that we had in 2015, where as we went around the room, we discovered that several of us had stopped at one child because we found it was just too difficult. The costs, the exhaustion, the double day of working for 8 or more hours, then coming home and doing 8 hours of care work and cooking and housework. One woman testified it was like the water was up to her neck and another child would feel like she was drowning. And these were women who had wanted 2 children or even more and didn't feel like their family was complete with only one. Others of us who didn't have kids testified that while we wanted them, it just didn't seem feasible given our unreliable health insurance, jobs that didn't provide leave, or from watching our mothers struggle, we believed it would push us into a sexist trap that would squeeze the rest of our lives. And we found our spouses were hesitant too, given their work lives and economic circumstances. So it made sense to us why this spontaneous birth slowdown or strike was happening. We were responding to our difficult conditions. But the problem was we were all blaming ourselves or thinking this was just our own isolated situation. And this is where consciousness raising, this method that the women's liberation movement developed in the 1960s, becomes so important because we can compare our experiences and draw conclusions and figure out who's benefiting. And we think that all over the country, there are people blaming themselves when they want kids, but they don't see how they can make it work. They're thinking, oh, if I'd gone into a better paying profession, maybe I should go back to school, or if I hadn't gone into so much debt for school, or if I could find a job with real paid leave. In other words, they see it as something that they're individually doing wrong rather than seeing this as a system that requires our unpaid work to function. Well, did U.S. workers ever really have better conditions for raising kids? For a time after World War II, people did expect the wages of one full-time male breadwinner to pay his expenses and those of his spouse and their children. And this was true at least for the unionized portion of the workforce. It was called the family wage, and it was given as the justification for paying men more than women, as in, well, he has a family to support. And then fringe benefits like health insurance and pensions were provided through the guy's job. Women were kept out of higher paying men's jobs, quote unquote, men's jobs, right, by a mix of laws, customs, and individual discrimination. Over several decades, women have broken down these barriers to more rewarding jobs and careers, and we've gained a measure of economic independence as a result. But starting in the 1970s, as our wages stagnated and costs rose, households kept up by sending both spouses out to work, meaning that each couple is now generating 80 or more hours a week of work for employers, where it had been generating 40. The job that the non-wage earning spouse used to do, the child rearing, the housework, caring for sick or frail family members, keeping our communities together, that's no longer included in one worker's paycheck. Instead, it's squeezed into the few hours left in the day after paid work. Well, the family wage, of course, is sexist because it locked in discriminatory pay. It made women dependent on male breadwinners. But it had one important progressive element that has not yet been replaced. At least it meant the employer was contributing some resources towards that family care job. Well, obviously, we don't want to go back to the sexist system of the family wage, but we argue that the way to arrange the care economy is to go forward to an increased social wage. So that's the term used in Europe to describe services and benefits that everyone in the society receives as a right. So obviously healthcare, but also universal child care, paid family leave for both parents, like the 16 months that they have in Sweden, or the year like they have in Australia. Paid sick leave mandated by law, so you don't have to negotiate that at the bargaining table. And how about shorter work hours? I mean, in Germany, they work on average 10 weeks a year less than we do. 10 weeks. But of course, all of this would require employers to put in significant resources, either by paying their taxes or by insurance companies having to give up all their profits, or they might have to give up some measure of control over their employees by allowing them to take long leave time. So it's really not just a question of enlightening our employers and elected officials. There's a power struggle involved in every workplace and on the national level federally. Now, immigration, of course, has compensated somewhat for slumping birth rates in the United States. And we found that this was really interesting. Among themselves, politicians and employers discuss immigration as a way to basically dump the work and expense of raising the next generation onto families, communities, and nations that immigrants are leaving behind. Corporate apologist Ben Wattenberg used to say that immigrants are raised on someone else's nickel. Now, this is a reverse of this incessantly promoted idea that immigrants are lucky to be here, they should be grateful, and all this. In fact, what it amounts to is the sending countries are subsidizing the US's stingy family policies, all for the benefit of US employers and our society in general. But there's a problem for these pro-immigration Republicans like Jeb Bush, who wrote a book called Immigration Wars. He's worried that birth rates are dropping in countries that have sent us immigrants, such as Mexico, where the birth rate has gone from 3.47 births per woman in 1990 to 2.1 today. And there have been similar drops in a lot of other countries, including the Philippines and India, for example. And then there are political liabilities for the employing class due to immigration. Immigrants may organize against mistreatment. They might unionize. They'll eventually vote. And you can see why corporate leaders are worried by comparing the political situation in two states that are now majority people of color, California and Texas, largely due to immigration. In California, labor organizing, led primarily by immigrants, has changed the politics of the state. In Texas, it's only frantic gerrymandering and terrorizing immigrant communities that has kept a right-wing government in charge there. And to see why this is important to oligarchs in Texas, you can just look at the fact that the minimum wage in California is twice that of the minimum wage in Texas, not to mention environmental regulations, better labor law, some paid leave, not nearly what we need. But all this is certainly enough to annoy the bosses. As a result, one thing that pro-corporate politicians all agree on is that while they want immigrants to come here and work, they don't want them to have any rights either on the job or in the community. This is why they favor these crackdowns that terrorize immigrant communities. At the same time, they support guest worker programs, which give employers complete control. And, if you object at all on the job, you can be deported. And in keeping with their desire not to spend anything to raise and educate the workforce, politicians on both sides of the aisle, all these factions, oppose family reunification, where you bring family members after you immigrate. From their perspective, that brings non-workers like older people and children who might need health care and education. So what does all this mean for us as we address the crisis we've been facing since the Dobbs decision? we think we'll be stronger in the abortion fight when we recognize that the battle is not at its base over religion or prudishness or to punish women for having sex or political machinations. It's a fight over our reproductive labor and how cheaply that work will be done. And the corporate power structure is not a neutral arbiter over a division of opinion among ordinary people. They actually have an interest in the outcome of this reproductive rights fight. And that means that our main enemy is not people who think abortion is wrong ethically. The main enemy is a power structure determined to get our work for cheap, both at home and on the job. We believe that with a fresh feminist angle showing how attacks on abortion rights and birth control access are about keeping our reproductive labor cheap, we think we have a chance to reach additional people. I think a lot of people generally already understand on some level that the rich and powerful want us to have kids, but they don't want us to pay for it. Most people can see that our employers won't even pay us enough so we can adequately support our children. And we can see that our parks and libraries are closing and our schools are falling apart and our hospitals are overwhelmed. But many people have only been exposed to this sort of feminism of the 1%, which basically says any problems you have supporting and raising your kids are your personal responsibility. But we aren't dumb or brainwashed for having kids. It's important, difficult work, and it's work that benefits the whole society, and we need the resources to be able to do it. And this is why we say that abortion is our right to strike against untenable reproductive working conditions. We think it's time that we defended our right to abortion on that basis rather than the individual choice rhetoric that's everywhere right now. And this means it's essential to confront the neoliberal framing of childbearing as an individual project that should only be undertaken by families who can afford it. We've all heard this kind of rhetoric, maybe even so much that it washes over us. But here's an example from Washington Post columnist Catherine Rampell. She says, quote, "Giving low-income women more control over their fertility promotes economic security, educational attainment, income mobility, and more stable environments for American children," unquote. So basically, she's prescribing birth control when what is required is higher pay, union jobs, affordable housing and education, and universal health care and child care. Then she continues, quote, "Children brought into the world before their parents were financially or emotionally ready for them are likewise disadvantaged before they're even born, no matter how loved they are," unquote. Now here she's just insulted the half the country that doesn't have $500 for an emergency. I mean, who is financially ready to have kids in this society, right? Only the rich, basically. So we should expose the implications of some of this neoliberal scolding, but mostly we need to organize a broad front to fight for all the things we need. The Black feminists who coined the term reproductive justice define it as 1, the right not to have a child, 2, the right to have a child, and 3, the right to parent children in safe and healthy environments. That's a quote from Loretta Ross. Now, it's not all gloom. We have actually made some progress over the last 3 or 4 years. Electoral threats from the left, primarily from Bernie Sanders, have inched the Democratic establishment forward on child care and family allowances. Every Democratic senator besides Joe Manchin has now gone on record for the Women's Health Protection Act, which would expand abortion access in states that have accumulated oppressive laws. And then last December, the Food and Drug Administration removed some of the red tape restricting the abortion pill, while several states have added laws to protect abortion and contraception. And these are stronger protections than we ever had under Roe. And it sounds like Vermont is just about to do that with your upcoming vote. So we believe that with a fresh understanding of what is at stake in the fight over reproductive control, we can recruit new people to this fight. So what would a winning strategy look like? our movement, with a few radical exceptions, has sort of been running based on a false narrative of how we won expanded abortion rights in the first place, starting in the 60s. We've been told ad nauseum that the Supreme Court gave us abortion rights. So through the decades, the bulk of organizing has focused on legal cases and lobbying, with the apologetic, timid, respectable approach you'd expect when your main audience is judges, legislators, and grant administrators rather than ordinary people. The movement doubled down, for example, on the right to privacy. Abortion is a private decision between you and your doctor, when in fact it was public truth-telling about abortion that gave the movement its strength in the 60s. What happened was, in 1968, women who were involved in the movement, from civil rights to anti-war work, started meeting without men and comparing their experiences. They called it consciousness raising, and it opened a whole new battlefront demanding women's liberation. And one of the many things they discovered was that a lot of them had illegal abortions and never told anybody about them. So the New York women's liberation group Redstockings decided to go public with this information in 1969. First, they disrupted a legislative reform hearing. This was a panel of male liberals who wanted to change the law, but not very much. And they stood up and testified about their own abortions or their inability to get them, and it went on for 30 minutes. They were eventually locked out of the hearing. So they organized their own hearing, a speak out consisting of a panel of a dozen women testifying about their illegal abortions. At a time it was still illegal. But also there was a stigma. You could get fired from your job, frozen out from your family, kicked out of school. Breaking the silence, breaking the stigma, making these things public had an electrifying effect and mobilized the growing women's liberation movement to demand full repeal of abortion laws in New York. And they won a partial victory in 1970, which made abortion legal in the first 2 trimesters in New York State if a doctor did it. We got there, and eventually we got Roe through giant marches, breakups of hearings, speakouts, disruptions, class action lawsuits, abortion referral services on every major campus, clergy defying the law to refer to illegal abortions across state lines. Some of them got arrested eventually. Doctors openly defying the law and getting arrested. Abortion was just part of the broad radical demands of the women's liberation movement and of the general freedom struggle to end the war in Vietnam, for Black liberation, worker health and safety, farm workers, Asian Americans, American Indians, Puerto Rican organizing. All of these forced the power structure back on its heels and forced some changes. And it was the result of all of that and more that the Supreme Court, after dithering around for a year, finally decided to take action on the Texas case we know as Roe versus Wade. But the decision was a compromise with the feminist demand for free abortion on demand and repeal of all restrictions. And that is important because while it's tempting to try to go back to the situation before the Dobbs decision, we all know that wasn't good enough. And it's way behind what other countries have. In Argentina, when they won their abortion law, which passed in December 2020, it says that up to 14 weeks, if you request an abortion, the national health system has to give it to you within 10 days. The movement didn't want gestational limits and also demanded 5 days. So they're working on making that real now, but it really casts a light on, okay, we got a technical legal right, but we never really won abortion in the United States. We won the right to come up with the money to pay for one. So this tells us if you want true access to reproductive rights, you can't get it without a national healthcare system. And we think this should be our demand, free abortion on demand through a national healthcare system, which was actually a slogan Redstockings raised in 1989. This suggests that given the powerful enemies arrayed against us, the only way we're going to win is by uniting to demand a broad array of things the working class needs, from unions to higher minimum wages, to healthcare, to guaranteed paid leave, quality childcare and schools and housing, and a fully funded public sector. And if we think about birth control and abortion as our right to demand better conditions for raising kids, then most people can see how that fits right in with all of these other things. Thanks so much, and I'll sit back and listen to your questions.
Well, I guess I'm back again, and I haven't gotten any questions from John yet, who's supposed to be sending them to me. But Jenny, I found it quite interesting, the whole issue of how under capitalism, low birth rates is actually a problem, and that is something I think that many people don't really understand. That it causes problems within a capitalist society, and that capitalism, even strives to get more kids. I just want to read the title of an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal from about 2 weeks ago. Capitalism says the more population, the merrier. Okay, that's the title, and the subtitle had in it that we should cheer for the 8 billionth person born, which is, I think, supposed to be this month or something, on the planet. Then we should actually cheer for that. I don't know if you want to comment on this while I'm taking.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. We have a lot of examples of socialist countries, and where they really did not have this idea that population growth at all costs. In China, for example, in 1980 they came up with this one-child policy, right? It was really one child for urban people, 2 children for rural people, and 3 children for oppressed nationalities. And their idea was that they wanted to spread the benefits of the development out throughout the population, but they couldn't keep up. So it was like a way to have the benefits of their revolution spread to more people, and that was their public reason for having that. Now, with the return of capitalism in China, however limited that is, they have gotten rid of the one-child policy. They're now encouraging more births. They're actually talking about cracking down on abortion. So we see the same sort of trajectory in Russia, the Soviet Union, and now Russia again, right? So the Soviet Union was the first place to legalize abortion and basically give you to you free in a hospital, starting in 1920. They led the world, and with the restoration of capitalism in Russia and other of the Soviet republics, they now are freaked out about low population rates, and they are encouraging people to have more kids. And it's a theme of like Vladimir Putin's annual addresses to the nation is that we have to have more kids. So at Poland, another example, right? Free abortion while it was socialist, abortion completely banned when they went back to capitalism. So there is something interesting that needs to be studied there about what it is about capitalism that really requires this constant growth, including a population.
Sorry, I muted myself, and now I've unmuted myself. Let me get to the questions, a couple of questions that were asked through the chat. What do you make of the small but seemingly growing number of self-proclaimed pro-life progressives, like the Progressive Anti-Abortion Uprising and others? That's a question for Jenny.
So I am skeptical. I continue to be skeptical that these are spontaneous outpourings of progressives suddenly deciding that abortion is a bad thing, because usually when you scratch the surface, you find out that there's a lot of funding from a source that would be a typical source that would give money to right-wing causes, and that's often turned out to be the case. But I also think that there is a problem with the way that as I mentioned, that people talk about abortion and as this, it's like abortion and birth control are being prescribed to people instead of the things that we need to raise our kids. So people are rightly a little bit annoyed by that. And I think, if partly that's because the feminist movement, and particular sort of the abortion rights movement, has been kind of gotten separated out from the general left struggle and labor struggle for the 99%, right? I mean, it's sort of gotten siloed, and so they don't understand what it sounds like when they say things like that Catherine Rampell quote that I had. And so I do think that, like, a good, solid, pro 99% labor, pro people position on this should be exactly what they're saying, what reproductive justice advocates are saying. It's not enough to just have birth control to solve the problem of, like, the crisis in working class life that we're experiencing. We have to have these things that we need for our lives: healthcare, childcare, paid leave, unions, a public sector that's not falling apart, all of these things. And so I think that if there is any genuine sort of progressive skepticism, we can quickly make the case that that's what's going on.
Thanks, Jenny. Let me ask there's another question. There are going to be more, but I'm not going to be able to ask them. The mainstream of the movement has been so focused on defending Roe and other legal approaches to preserving abortion rights, but that seems to have been a losing strategy. Can you say more about how you think we should be refocusing our action following the Dodd decision?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think we should be defying the laws publicly. This was a strategy they used in the 60s, and in states where it's illegal, I think we need to start really openly doing this. We had 100 years of underground abortion, and it didn't change the law. It was only when we made the fight public that it made a difference. So, well, it may feel more concrete to do underground efforts to provide abortions. At least someone was able to get an abortion. Open defiance of the law is what's going to actually change this. And somewhat in that spirit, National Women's Liberation, which has a chapter in Florida, we started a pledge in Florida to aid and abet abortion, initially to defy the Florida legislature, but now we've gone national with it. And this was a strategy that we used to get the morning after pill over the counter. So we're urging people to sign on to publicly state that they will aid and abet abortion, defying the law, at aidandabotabortion.org. And our website is womensliberation.org, where you can sign up for our emails or join if you like. So aidandabotabortion.org. We have a whole explanation. You can submit testimony. I also think we need to attack the court and the Senate, which both, the legitimacy of the Supreme Court and the U.S. Senate. These are two undemocratic bodies that are working in tandem to enforce undemocratic laws. So the court says, for example, corporations can spend unlimited money, or it destroys union rights in the public sector, or shreds voting protections, or says the EPA can't regulate greenhouse gases. And then the Senate, with its undemocratic makeup and the filibuster rule on top of it, means that we will have no legislative response. So what that has left the court, right-wing maniacs on the court, to legislate for our country. This is a complete crisis in democracy, and we should treat it as such. I also think that we need to, especially in states where it's illegal, defend people who are seized by the state for violating the new laws. This is an extremely important front. And even before Dobbs, when Lizelle Herrera was arrested in South Texas, it was in the spring, for allegedly having an at-home abortion, an immediate local mobilization freed her. There was national outrage. A case like this gives us an opportunity to inflict political pain on any prosecutor who dares to try to impose these laws on us. That's a very important front. And another front, I think, is a little more long-term, keep up the fight to get the FDA to put abortion pills over the counter. We managed to get some motion on that in December. So now in legal states, you can get pills in the mail, say from abortionondemand.org. And in illegal states, you can get them from overseas through aidaccess.org. But studies are showing that the pills will be safe over the counter, and there are more studies right now underway to confirm that. This would increase access significantly, and the target is a federal target, so you can do it from anywhere. So it took us 10 years to get the morning after pill over the counter, so I imagine that's the kind of timeline it might take. But that will make access much more easy for people in all the states. And then finally, I think the goal needs to be winning Medicare for all that provides abortion and all forms of contraception. That's, and there's actually a really good historical precedent for how that could play out. So a national system like Medicare is not administered by the states. If the states say they don't want to pay for it, it's not up to them. It's a federal program. And when there's a historical precedent for using federal programs to enforce civil rights like this, when Medicare was rolled out in the mid-60s, it required hospitals to end racial segregation, which you can imagine in 1965 was a big lift, right? Yet the power of the federal government and the specter of money getting denied, combined with strong civil rights legislation, forced it through. And there's a great book and movie that go with it called The Power to Heal that tell that story. So that's one way of thinking about how this could become a federal right that actually fulfills the promise of being free and accessible to everyone.
Wow. Jenny, thanks so much. This, I've been taking notes, and I assume other people have too, because you've brought out a lot of different critical issues, and also shown how many of these are connected in ways that most of us, I'd say, including myself, didn't quite understand to that extent. So we greatly appreciate your talk. I want to thank everybody else who participated in this, and I hope that I wish good luck to the interesting discussion to the people at the University of Vermont who will be staying on to talk about this, and if there are other groups, to those too. So good night, and thanks again, Jenny, for a very, very important talk.
Thanks so much, and I'm very inspired by the struggle that you all are doing in Vermont around getting something into the Constitution. So I'm rooting for it. Thank you so much for all your work on that.
Thanks. Good night.